On today's episode of Water Cooler Weekly, we are joined by Shadow Minister for Health and the Member of Parliament for McMahon, the Honourable Chris Bowen. Chris gives us his story of growing up in Western Sydney and what it was that made him jump into politics. He touches on some of the insights of how he approaches his job and also goes on to talk about some of the achievements that he is proud of from his career in politics to date. Regardless of what political party you align yourself with, if you align with one at all, this is a really interesting look at the mind of someone who has held some of Australia's most important and prestigious political jobs. It was a great thrill for me to get Chris on the show, and I really do hope you enjoy the episode. It's my pleasure now to welcome on the Shadow Minister for Health and Member of Parliament for McMahon, the Honourable Chris Bowen. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great pleasure, Chris Bowen.
We have a very unique and special name, and I'm very thankful that because of that name, I was able to get someone of your stature to come onto the show. I think first off, I will have to ask you is I'm constantly getting messages, whatnot from people whenever you come on, whenever you go on the radio, you go on TV. And I do have to wonder that whenever I say win a Darwin Valley Badminton Championship, how do you cope with the people messaging you saying congratulations?
Oh, it's tough. It's just this constant stream, and I'm saying, no, I'm the other Chris Bowen. No, it's a constant sort of battle for both of us, I reckon. There's also a third one. There's in Sydney, there's a radio shock jock called Ray Hadley, and his producer's name was Chris Bowen. And then now he's suing Ray Hadley for bullying. So I get a bit of traffic about that Chris Bowen as well. But I've said I only ever get bullied on air, never been bullied off air. So
and we have a much thicker skin. We wouldn't file lawsuits for that.
Well, good luck to the other Chris Bowen, I guess. I guess we stick with him. But, it's a bit of fun. There's not that many of us around. You're more, you're going back. My family came from Wales in 1880 to Australia. Do you know what your background is?
No, that's actually a great question. I actually don't know the origin of it. I do remember telling my grandpa who, that I was like, I've got Chris Bowen coming on the show, and I can't repeat what he said or what my dad said when I said you were coming on, because they didn't believe me, to be honest. So
all right, so it's not that they're liberals.
No.
Oh, okay, that's right.
No.
When you said you can't repeat it, I thought it might have been sort of stream of abuse. That bastard.
No, I think it's more of the lines that they didn't think that the show had that kind of a pull to get a guest like yourself, but they probably shouldn't.
Hey,
they probably shouldn't doubt me like that.
They shouldn't. They should back you. It's the Water Cooler Weekly. I mean, it's a big deal.
Absolutely, and that's a sensational promo clip there, which I'll use.
There you go.
Yeah. All right. We'll get stuck into it. Born just in Western Sydney, what was life like growing up in Smithfield?
Look, it was pretty good. We weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination. It's a small sort of fibro house in Smithfield, which for the listeners who aren't from Sydney is about an hour west of Sydney proper. And it was a pretty, very typical suburban upbringing in a small cul-de-sac in Smithfield. My dad actually was a shift worker, so he, for most of my childhood, worked the midnight shift, the graveyard shift. So he'd go to work at 11 p.m. and come home at 7. And my mum was a childcare worker, but she worked in family daycare, which meant she looked after the kids at home. So she had a pretty, hard job in educating and raising kids while keeping them quiet, so my dad could get some sleep in the front room. So, in a fairly sort of modestly small house. So, it was, I think, a sort of very typical suburban working class sort of existence for us. My brother Paul is 10 years older than me, and he was sort of, off the scene for much of my childhood because he was sort of off living life. But it was a good existence, and learn a lot at the local Smithfield Public, and then St John's Park High School, which was at that point the biggest public high school in New South Wales, or the biggest high school period. I'm sure we had like 1,500, I think at one stage 1,700 kids. So you had to have your wits about you to get through that sort of big massive humanity at high school. Yeah.
Usually someone who has served as a treasurer in Australia would be the most famous person from that suburb. But we discussed that you lived across the road from Harry Kuehl.
Yeah, Harry Kuehl. So not just the same suburb, but the same street. A few doors down, actually was another guy who's not famous, but who ended up working in Parliament House as Deputy Chief of Staff to the then Treasurer Wayne Swan. So there was a fair bit happening in that street. And Harry's about 3 years younger than me. We went to the same primary school, but he went to a different high school. But sometimes when I visit my local schools, I like to sort of give a motivational talk and talk to them about following their dreams. And I tell them, whatever your dream is, it just requires hard work. My dream was to go to uni, be the first in my family to go to uni, and and to get into something involved in policy or economics or politics. But Harry's dream was to play soccer for Australia. We were both chasing our dreams. I'd come home from school, get off the bus, go into my room and start studying. He'd get off the bus and go and start playing soccer, football in the front yard. And sometimes it used to annoy me because I was trying to study, and he was he sort of had this fake goalpost on his parents' B&D roller door. So he'd stand at the bottom of the driveway and kick the soccer ball against the roller door,
which isn't
4 hours.
Quiet.
It isn't quiet for like 4 hours straight or something. He was practicing his aim at the goalpost, the fake goalpost. And I was inside trying to, remember some bloody modern history fact or something. So, and every so often I think, oh, bugger it, I'd just go out and play soccer with him. And of course, he was 3 years older than me and younger than me, and would absolutely thrash me absolutely every time, which I felt bad about then, but don't feel so bad about now.
No. It's a very nice little, it's kind of a flex to have on people be like, I used to play a bit of soccer with Harry Kuehl when I was growing up. Nothing major.
Yeah, what do they say? I don't know how many he's got. But say he's got 3, so it's 3 FA Cups between us, between Harry and I. We've represented between us. We've represented Australia in soccer. 12 times or something. So yeah,
that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, that's right. That's the way I like to think about it as well. Anyway, yeah, he's a good fella, Harry, and his parents still live there in Smithfield, and he still sort of is connected to the area. He's a good fella.
Yeah, we'll move on from that. So you finished university and you pretty much jumped straight into politics. I'd like to know when the idea had sort of formed into your head that politics was something that you wanted to do.
Yeah, pretty young, pretty early. So I actually joined the Labor Party at 15. So I was still at school when I took myself off to a Labor Party meeting. Looked them up. This was pre-internet, but found out I joined the Labor Party and rocked up at a branch meeting. And I was always interested in politics. And I always felt that, growing up in Smithfield, a very, frankly, pretty modest existence with Dad working his guts out all night, that it struck me that there wasn't necessarily somebody on the side of people like my folks, and politics wasn't about them. And so in a very unformed way, not a very philosophical way, I started thinking about, well, how do we change this? How do we get sort of people had better go. And then also at the same time, I went to, school with some very bright people.
Mm-hmm.
It's very clear to me that they were never going to uni because it's just not what you did. People from our sort of part of the world didn't go to uni so much in those days. It just was unthinkable for many people. I was pretty determined to go to uni, but a lot of my friends were smarter than me, and they just, leave school at year 10. And I thought, there's something not right here. So combination of those two things led me to think, well, again, as I stress, in a very unformed, non-philosophical way,
Mm-hmm.
maybe politics is something, I can get involved in to try and make things a bit fairer. And it struck me that the only party at least thinking and talking about things like that was, from my point of view, the Labor Party. So I wandered off to a Labor Party meeting at 15, quite enjoyed it. I started reading a lot of politics early. I got a prize in year 6 for citizenship, and it was a $10 book voucher. This is 1984, so $10 was a pretty, impressive sum of money. And so I went off to Angus and Robertson with my $10 book voucher, and I bought a book by Paul Kelly called The Hawke Ascendancy, which I've still got. And it sort of just started my reading in politics, and now I've got 3,000 books on politics or something. It's like, and Paul Kelly is, one of the nation's most preeminent political journalists, and it took me a while to tell him that, the first book I ever bought was one of his, because but it's a little bit, maybe not so much embarrassing, but anyway, so yeah, that's where it all started. And then I got the people in the Labor Party were very kind. I said, well, you can read and write, and you seem pretty sensible, so you should think about, doing more in the Labor Party. So they got me. I was very young. I ran for the local council, an unwinnable spot, but just for experience. And then 4 years later, ran for a winnable spot and got on. And
Mm-hmm.
a few years later, got to be mayor. And then a few years later than that, the federal member announced she was retiring. And by that stage, the wonderful men and women of the Labor Party locally said, well, you're our pick. And so I was chosen as a Labor candidate for federal parliament, which was a great honour.
Absolutely. Now, there are two things that I'd sort of want to touch on there. Was there anyone early days into politics that you looked up to in the Labor Party that, you sort of maybe not based how you went about it, but sort of looked at them and was like, this is someone I can look up to?
Yeah, unquestionably, there was one figure above all. I grew up when Paul Keating was Treasurer. So the 6 o'clock news every night was Paul Keating in Parliament, really just laying out his views so strongly and talking about change and saying the economy's got to change. And, I remember the Banana Republic, which is now a part of political history. I remember him saying that. He was just a powerhouse, which I just really admired. And he was from Bankstown, which is just not far from Smithfield. Mm-hmm. So he was a Western Sydney boy like me, and he became the treasurer, which was really for a long time what I wanted to do. And so really Paul Keating above all else was my hero in many senses. And much later in life, I've gotten to know him, and now he's sort of moved from a hero to almost basically a mentor. We mm-hmm. talk most days, and he's still got this remarkable command of the English language, and he rings up and suggests lines that I might want to use in a press conference, most of which I can't use because they're unprintable. But he still cares very much about Australia. Obviously, he's at a different stage of his life and doing different things now, but he still cares very much about the country and where it's going. And he's just a remarkable Australian.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. There's sort of like a bit of an aura about him, and even when you go to say when someone meets someone that they look up to, it's very hard sometimes to look at them and go, this is not the person I idolize. This is someone who I now need to work with and work alongside.
Yeah. And sometimes people say, never meet your hero because you're going to be disappointed close up. Mm-hmm. But that, which I guess that's always a risk, but certainly it's one of the honours of my life to have Paul as a friend. And I don't regard it. I haven't been disappointed by meeting him at all.
No, that's great. A small segue here, and you touched on the first sort of campaign that you ran was an unwinnable seat. I'd be interested to know that how much of that was a learning experience for you, and let's say now if you're going into a campaign, how different is it from say way back then to now, and how much have things changed in sort of your approach?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is, Chris, that you're running for an unwinnable seat is really important, I think, in terms of being a young person learning about politics, because politics is not glamorous. You know, you see the glamorous bits on TV, you know, and all the fancy bits, but by and large, politics and a political career is a slog. It's, you know, hard work. It's away from your family a lot. It's it's opening yourself up to that free and frank community feedback we were talking about before.
Mhm.
You know, people feel and that they are entitled to tell you what they think of you, and they are. And you've got to get a certain toughness about that. So, um, you know, it's not all beer and skittles and just walking, you know, getting a rails run through a political career is, I think, not the way to do it, because at some point it goes wrong and you've got to learn what it's like to lose. And so you're better off losing early and getting
Mhm.
used to it. In terms of what's changed, oh, look, I mean, I guess in some things, everything's changed. In some senses, everything's changed. Social media did not exist when I was starting out. I mean, you know, it was just unthinkable. There was no, we didn't have, I remember the first mobile phone I used in a campaign, which was in 1991, and you had to have you know, a sash to carry it. You know, it came with its own pack
Mhm.
that you put over your back to carry the phone and the battery. And it was cutting edge technology. You know, we thought we were pretty special because we had, you know, we rented 4 mobile phones for this campaign.
Yeah.
Um, and it's all changed now. You know, there's, for those of us in public life, everybody's got a camera. So if you think, oh, I'll just cross against the lights, or I'll, you know, or I'll, you know, yell some abuse out the car window at this guy who's just cut me off, you know, you're going to be filmed. So just
Mhm.
anything you do, just work on the basis that it's going to appear on social media. Um, and so that's all changed. But fundamentally, though, while most of it has changed, the basics of it haven't.
Mhm.
It's about talking to people, earning their respect, earning their trust, understanding what people are concerned about in the community. Now, the methods of doing that have changed. In the old days, you're limited. You could door knock, you could do mail surveys, that sort of stuff. The methods have changed and become more efficient, but the fundamentals haven't. It's about getting out there and spreading your message, but it's also about learning, being accessible, being available to the people whom you're asking to vote for you. And that
Mhm.
hasn't changed in the 30 years I've been doing it.
There's something that I did want to touch on is the fact that, you know, we mentioned you grew up in Smithfield, where you've held the seat for a first prospect and now for McMahon for such a long time. How much of it do you think, you know, how important is the area to you? And also, you know, the fact that you spent such a great time growing up there, and you touched on why you got into politics because you wanted to make a change. Do you think that's why, you know, you've been able to hold the seat for so long from a time where social media wasn't existed to now it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to me. I mean, everybody's different, every MP is different, but I get a particular kick out of representing the area I grew up in and still live in. You know, and the community is so important. You know, I drop my kids off at school. That's the same school I went to,
Mhm.
and and I represent. Well, I represent that community in the federal parliament, in the House of Representatives, and so I represent all the people I grew up in with, all the kids my kids are growing up with, all the community around us that I know so well. Um, so to me, that's special. That's a particular honour. I mean, it's an honour for anyone to serve in federal parliament, of course, but to be chosen by the community that raised you,
Mhm.
I think is a particular buzz and a particular honour. And when I get up in Parliament, I talk about Smithfield or Fairfield or the other suburbs around. To me, it's just particularly meaningful to know that, you know, I've spent all my life there. You know, basically, my parents moved to Smithfield when I was 1 year old, and I don't remember living anywhere else. And I've moved in my life from one end of Smithfield to the other.
Yeah. which is very rare these
and
days.
yeah, these days, yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. But I still do, I pop down the shops, my shorts and t-shirt on a Sunday afternoon when, my wife tells me we'll run out of soy sauce or something.
Yeah.
And, I'll run into people who I went to school with, or I run into parents of kids at my kids' school, for the parents. And, they might stop me to talk about current affairs or something. It's nice. It's a particular buzz and an honour to be sort of chosen by that community, I think. And it does mean I do understand, I think, what makes the community tick. And I've seen a lot of changes, in my area in particular. I represent, I argue, it's the most multicultural area in Australia. So I've seen waves of new communities. When I was growing up, Vietnamese people were still arriving in great numbers on boats. Well, not so much boats to Australia, but out of refugee camps that they'd gotten to by boat. Then now we've got African and Indian migration in a much bigger way. So the community is changing and evolving. And I get to know the new communities very closely, but I also understand, say, for example, the Vietnamese community, which I grew up, the kids who arrived at school on their first day, didn't speak any English, are now the leaders of the Vietnamese community, and, often are doctors and lawyers, and, have been Australian success stories. And I think growing up as part of that and living that every day is a special part of it.
Yeah, no, that's incredible to hear. I think a lot of the times, probably people will look at a politician as maybe not being as accessible as they would like. But if you talk about, you running down to the shops and then running into these people, I think they get to see a complete different side to, say, a politician that is what we see. Like, I can't remember running into a politician or, from whatever area I was living in this sort of circumstance.
Yeah, and I think most politicians, of course, you can't see everyone, on a visit to the shops. But there was one funny story happened a few weeks ago. I was out shopping, just getting a few things at Coles, and again, I had my shorts and t-shirt on or whatever. It was a hot day, and I was just going through, and I was in a bit of a hurry, like I had stuff to do. But one bloke stopped me in the aisle and said, "Oh, look, can I just talk to you about this problem I've got with my neighbour? I'm fighting with my neighbour, and can you give me some advice as the MP?" And I spent 10 minutes with him explaining, well, really, an MP doesn't sort out neighbourhood problems,
Yeah.
But here's some advice that you might want to have a think about these sorts of things. Have you spoken to them? Have you spoken to council? All that sort of stuff. And then I got to the next aisle, and a lady stopped me to say, "Oh, I want to talk to you about the cost of going to the doctor. It's getting more expensive." And I listened to her and had a chat to her. And then I got to the car, and I'm unloading the car, and this guy came up to me. He said, "Look, I've seen 3 other people stop you so far today, so I really am reluctant to stop you. But I just wanted to stop you and thank you, because you're the reason my wife's in Australia. You won't remember, but 7 years ago, I came to see you. We were having trouble with her visa. We were in love, but she couldn't get permission to come to Australia, and you got it sorted. And now we're married and got 4 kids. And I just wanted to say thanks." And, that was really nice. That's a really sort of touching thing. I did ask if the kids were well behaved, because I sort of feel responsible.
Yeah.
But that's part of it. That's part of being accessible. And, long may it be the case. And often I find, because I represent a multicultural community, many of the people who have arrived in Australia in recent years, if they do see me in the street, they can't believe it, because they've come from a country where an MP would wander around with 16 bodyguards and machine guns, and a normal member of the community would have no chance of ever getting to speak to a member of parliament. And yet, they're down at the shops and they see the member of parliament walk past with a shopping trolley. And
running to grab some soy sauce.
Yeah, exactly. And long may that continue. I mean, that is a wonderful thing about Australia. We don't want to be the situation where our politicians are sort of behind glass. Obviously, when you get to the sort of level of Prime Minister, there's an extra level of protection and all that sort of stuff, and that's perfectly appropriate. But, long may it be the case that our politicians are wandering around the streets like the rest of us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's that's an incredible point and a really cool story that I think will really segue nicely into this next question, which is regardless of what anyone does for a job or for a career, at the end of it, and obviously, we're not at the end of your career, but everyone can sort of sit back and go, I did this or I did that, and sort of just, look fondly. Is there anything that you sort of look back now, obviously a situation like that where you go, like, I can't believe that I'm in this position to, have affected someone's life or have to done a piece of work like this?
Yeah, I mean, there's that feeling really comes out in the day to day in the electorate office. So an MP's job, particularly an MP who's a minister or shadow minister, really has many different sort of rhythms. Like
Hmm.
when I'm in my community, in my electorate office, I'm seeing maybe 6 or 7 people on a given day, helping them with their problems, and that's a great sense of achievement when somebody comes in. You might see them, and 6 months later they come back and they bring you a cake and they say, "You sorted my problem, and I just wanted to bring you a small token of thanks or something." That's lovely, and it might be something which is not all that important for you or me,
Hmm.
but it's absolutely vital to them.
Hmm.
And it's
Absolutely.
really important to them. So that's the sort of upside. The downside is that there's some people you can't help,
Yeah.
and even they might be very deserving. Now, there's some people who, frankly, they come and see you, and it's a try on. And I take a very, when I'm seeing constituents, I take a very honest and frank approach, which is sometimes not the easiest thing to do. But I always tell people, listen, sorry, you don't have a case. I can't help you. What you are asking for is impossible and, frankly, not justified. So, I have constituents come to see me and say, look, I've got $10 million in the bank, but they won't give me the age pension. Yeah, guess what? They're not going to give you the age pension, and
Hmm.
I'm not going to try and get you the age pension. So,
I'm not helping you with
so,
that one.
but, but then you get other people who are very, very genuine, and in a very desperate situation, but you just know it's too far. Often people don't see their MP until it's too far gone. I mean, they just got
Hmm.
themselves in so much hassle. And, sometimes I sit, we sort of tend to schedule half an hour for a constituent interview, but sometimes it takes an hour just to, get right to the bottom of what their problem is.
Yeah.
And you can help them maybe a bit at the margins, but, they might have got themselves way over their head in debt, and it's really hard. And that's the frustrating side of it. So I went through one day. I came home and I said, my wife and kids said, "How was your day?" And it only occurred to me once I got home and they asked me. I said, "Every single person I met today at some point cried." Because they're seeing their MP and they've got a big problem and they start crying. And every appointment after appointment after appointment. So MPs actually also need to look after their mental health, our mental health, because
Yeah.
we're dealing with
Absolutely.
with stuff every day, and you've got to keep your own role in perspective. You're going to help everybody you can. Some people you can't, and you're going to do your best, and you've got to make sure that your mental health's in decent nick, because it can get you down as well.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you can always think about that one person that, you weren't able to help, despite the fact that, say,
Yeah,
you were able to help the 25 people that you met with beforehand. And it's a natural, mindset for anyone, and you can adapt it to any circumstance. You could have 150 nice things said about you, but it's that one that's either negative or, you can't help, that stays with you. So another really good segue into the next question, because it is going to be based around sort of mindset, and the enormity of it is that you've held positions like Treasurer of Australia and Minister for Immigration, which are incredibly important roles. And I would love to know how you could sort of one, handle the enormity of a role like that, and to sort of process everything, and how important it is for not just yourself but for so many people.
yeah. Chris, you sort of get used to it, and you just sort of sometimes have to tell yourself, well, I'm just going to give it my best shot. I'm just going to do my best. And it's really no whether you're the Treasurer of Australia, or, the principal of the local school, or the whatever job it is. We all have jobs of responsibility, and you just got to tell yourself, well, I'm just going to give it my honest best shot. I mean, the difference is in my line of work, if you stuff it up, the whole country's watching, so that's high pressure,
Yes.
For most of us, if we make an error at work, well, the boss might know, and it might be embarrassing, or some of your work colleagues might know. If in my line of work, it's going to be on the news that night and on the front page of the papers the next day. So that adds a certain level of, stress.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, though, that comes and goes. I mean, sometimes I have colleagues come to send me and they say, I've got this really bad headline about me. And I just shrug my shoulders and say, you know what the thing about that newspaper is? And they go, what? And I say, it's going to be wrapping somebody's fish and chips tomorrow. Like, life moves on.
You'll be on it again, don't worry.
That's right. But, we'll all live tomorrow, and they'll be worried about somebody else tomorrow. So just don't beat yourself up tonight. So yeah, there's a certain level of stress, but ultimately it's a great honour. I mean, we say that, but it is a great honour that you've been chosen to do these jobs, and you just got to give it your best shot. And I love history. I mentioned before that I read a lot of books about history and politics, and that gives you a good perspective because you read about the challenges. You look back and you think some of the great names, say Australian politics, the Curtins, the Chifleys, the Whitlams, the Hawkes, the Keatings, from my point of view, and you think, these are such great people doing such great things. You read about their everyday challenges, and what they were going through was enormous, and they stuffed things up, and there was fights, and all that stuff was going on. And you think, well, I'm now in their shoes, and yeah, I'm stuffing things up too. I'm making mistakes, but I'm doing my best as they did. You just got to try and look at it in that perspective, and you're not perfect, as I sometimes say. I'm a public servant, not a perfect servant.
Mm-hmm.
I do my best. I don't always get it right, and that's the way for everything. Whether you're Prime Minister, Treasurer, or any other job, you just got to do your best.
Yeah, I think one really good question on that is you mentioned that you like history, and you just rolled off all of those names that are very well-known Australian politicians. Do you ever pinch yourself and say you're in Parliament, you're speaking, and you find yourself caught in a moment where you're like, just think back to all the people who have been before you doing, what you were doing, talking in those halls. Does that ever creep into your mind, or has it?
Pretty much every day. Pretty much every day. And the day that you don't do that is probably the day that you've been there too long, because it is such an enormous honour. And yeah, we're in a new Parliament House, right? So it doesn't have quite the same history. It's 32 years old now, but it's not, the hundreds of years of history. But the dispatch boxes, those boxes in Parliament that we speak at, they came from the old Parliament House. So every time I stand and I lean on it, Curtin and Chifley and Hawke and Keating and Whitlam all leant on the same thing. Their hands were where my hands are. And the day that you don't feel that sort of weight of responsibility in history, it's probably the day that, you shouldn't be there anymore, because you're not feeling the weight of responsibility. So yeah, every day I walk into that green room, the House of Representatives chamber, I get a buzz.
Mm-hmm.
I get a little stir of butterflies, because the country's watching, even if the chamber's empty and you're making a speech at 8 o'clock at night. If you make a mistake, they'll soon hear about it. Yeah,
absolutely.
Spread like wildfire. So it's a big thing, and I think we should feel that responsibility and that weight of history on us.
Yeah, it is really interesting to me. As to be honest with you, not someone who is will sit down and watch Q&A or watch Parliament. Someone who's just genuinely interested in sort of the enormity of the decisions and stuff that get made. And I was watching a movie, Vice, which was about Donald Rumsfeld, and he's having a conversation saying Richard Nixon's standing on the other side of this door having a conversation with someone that's about to affect millions of lives. And I'm obsessed with stuff like that, where you're standing in a spot where you talked about someone who was standing in this very spot made this decision 25, 30 years ago, and that affected all these people. And it's so fascinating to hear different people's perspectives when they've experienced something like that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess we all deal with it in different ways. And we all see it in different ways. But you're right. And you do know sitting around the cabinet room, I'm not in the cabinet at the moment because we're in opposition, but, you sit around the cabinet room and it's a group of 20 people who've been chosen to make the fundamental decisions for 25 million. And yeah, you've just got to, every time you walk into that cabinet room, you've got to feel that. And, some decisions are more important than others. There are some really weighty decisions where the cabinet's sitting around for hours, weighing it up, knowing the implications, and I used to sit on the National Security Committee of Cabinet as well, getting briefings on the situation in the Middle East and that sort of stuff and making decisions. And yeah, you feel those. And then there are other decisions which are more sort of straightforward, but ultimately the principle's the same. That's, while we're there, that's our job. And we're not always going to get it right, but you need to be able to, at the end of the day, say, I didn't get it always right, but bloody hell, I did my best.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be interested to know how your personal approach changes as opposed to when you're in government, as opposed to being in the opposition.
Well, it's a very different job in terms of, your day-to-day life. When you're a minister, your diary is very managed. You've got, like 20 staff. You're dealing, you're running a government department. So you've got, hundreds of decisions to make a day, and you don't really often get that chance to sort of step back and reflect. And it's your job to sell the government's achievements and be positive. You go in opposition, all of a sudden all that goes. You go from like having 20 staff to 4 staff overnight. Nobody wants to know what you think about anything. You're not making any decisions by and large, and it's your job to be negative. You've got to point out what the government's doing, what the government's doing wrong. So you go from being Mr. Positive to Mr. Negative. Now, I think the key to that, though, is to remember that one day, hopefully, you're going to be back there. So stick to your principles. And I certainly take the approach, I've got plenty I can criticise the current government about and do, but I've got to be able to look in the mirror and say the criticism is fair.
Yeah.
And so, and I think the punters the community would be onto me if I was on the news saying, this is a disgrace, if I didn't really think it was. And so sometimes I get criticism from Labor Party members saying you're too soft on the Liberals. Well, I actually say, well, I've sat in that chair and I want to sit in that chair again. And I've got to say the decision they made today is the same decision I would make, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Yeah. So basically, you've just got to call it as you see it and just be, without sounding sort of too trite, true to your principles. And if you do that, I mean, I like to say there's 2 parties of government. There's a few parties in Australia. There's 2 parties of government, Labor and Liberal. Right? The next government of Australia is going to be a Labor government, whether it's at the next election, the election after that. It's not going to be a Greens government or a One Nation government, right? And after the Liberals are done, it's going to be a Labor government. So we're a party of government. So therefore, there's a responsibility on us to be sort of sensible and mature as we criticise the government and as we call for them to do better and make suggestions as to how they should. And if you take it that way, I like to sometimes say we're not the opposition, we're the alternative government, and we are. I mean, we're not here to oppose for opposition's sake. We're here to be the alternative, to provide an alternative, not an echo. We're not paid to agree with each other all the time. That's a one-party state. But I think we are required to be constructive and fed income in our criticisms.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. And I think you can take the view at, while you might not be in government, it wasn't as if, 100% of the votes were Liberal or,
No.
The margins for these things are often so small that you can sort of that can get lost in the fact that, you look at they say, oh, well, Labor's lost, but they're like, we had say 47, 48, whatever % of the votes. And it is something that, I sort of touched on. The mindset is that, you can sort of go from having 20 staff to 4 staff, but then you have to sort of, say, well, let's not maybe throw a tantrum or change the approach too much like if we do the right things, we stay on track, we'll get to where we were. And I think that's a really level-headed and a really good response that, you know, that you'd like to see. Obviously, this year there's no sort of sugarcoating that it's had a massive effect on everyone. You know, we touched on mental health before, and you have to look after it yourself. And I think just because you hold a certain level of office and that you're looked on by so many people, that it is important. What is your biggest take from this year, and in terms of your mindset and your focus, and maybe something that's shifted the way you approach things moving forward with work and from a personal sense?
Well, I mean, I think for everyone, it's, you know, has been such a change, hasn't it, that it's made us all reevaluate, and we've all sort of gotten different things out of the year, you know. Certainly I've, you know, on the upside, you know, I'm normally on an airplane 3 or 4 days a week. I was on a plane today. It was like, I think, the third time this year.
Yeah.
You know, so that's a huge change, and it has given me the opportunity to be home a lot more and a lot more time with my kids, which is a positive in every sense. But in terms of what it's changed for me in terms of my approach to the job, to me, it has reminded us, in Australia in particular, what can be done when we turn our mind to it, you know, because Australia's done well, you know, touch wood. And you think, well, at the beginning of this crisis, I mean, we went into this crisis with fewer intensive care beds per head of population than Italy did, right? And we were watching what was happening in Italy, and people dying because they didn't have enough intensive care beds. And that's what really concentrated the minds of Australian politicians, state, federal, everyone. And to everybody's great credit now, we've gone from having 2,000 intensive care beds in Australia to 7,000. And you think, geez, that's pretty remarkable, because we're not just talking beds, right? We're talking intensive care beds. They're a serious piece of expensive equipment, right? That you can't just build in a day, but we managed it. And so I think, well, if we could do that, what else could we do?
Yeah.
If we really turn our mind to things, what about all these things that have been in too hard basket, you know? If we applied the same laser-like focus, and governments working together and getting manufacturers in, if we applied the same focus to Indigenous health as we have to intensive care beds, what could we do in Australia?
Yeah.
Now, the key is everybody working together and everybody having an agreed set of priorities. The reason we could increase intensive care beds from 2,000 to 7,000 is because it was one of just, you know, 2 or 3 priorities for every government. If you've got 15 priorities, well, then you don't have any, because you're not going to achieve anything, because everybody's trying to do too much. So you really got to focus in and laser down on what's achievable. But then things that have been in the too hard basket, we really can go on the to-do list, from the too hard basket to the to-do list, because when we want to as a country, we can do serious stuff and hard stuff, and stuff that everybody would have said in February was just impossible. There's a lot of caveats to it, but it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's incredible to see that, you know, you can take that view out of it, and those 7,000 beds, they're not going to be restricted to, you know, when COVID does come and pass. You know, that's an incredible amount of beds that, you know, that will save so many lives based on, you know, what they can achieve. So I think that's the perfect way to finish it. And I just want to thank you for coming on and agreeing to share a little bit of a story about you and the, you know, how you approach your job, which is a very important one. And I just want to wish you all the best for the rest of this year, and keep up the good Chris Bowen name for me.
Well, you too, mate. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I knew you were going to be a good fellow as soon as I saw your name. I thought, well, he's just obviously a top bloke, I thought to myself. So we'll go on his podcast, no problem. So,
yeah.
And it's lived up to expectations. So maybe when it's, you know, when you can get to Sydney, we'll find that old Chris Bowen has been in court with Ray Hadley, and the three of us will, you know, go out and have a beer or something.
Oh, sounds incredible to me. I've got a few questions about Ray Hadley that I'd love to get answered. So I think he's the right man for it.
Yeah, you got to go to the other Chris Bowen for that. That's right.
Yeah, all good. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Well, as the old saying goes, the British comedians used to say, he's been Chris Bowen and he's been Chris Bowen. So this has been the Chris Bowen Show.
Perfect. Thank you very much.